Fantasy Grounds has some flaws. It's not 100%, perfect, but it has some good qualities too. So when you go to join a game, generally, your game master will give you a password and he'll give you some credentials. So if you first launch Fantasy Grounds and you just have the demo, you need to connect to the website, which is your password for the forums. You do that in the settings. So if you come to the settings area, you can open that up. You can put in your password and your username, and if you have a license, you can put that in, hit save, and then it'll allow you to be connected to Fantasy Grounds. Even if you don't have content, you still have to be logged in. And then once that happens and your GM gives you the credentials and stuff, you want to update Fantasy Grounds first and then restart it. And then after you're done with that, then you will join the session. So there's a join campaign button, which is down here in the middle. And you'll get a list of servers if you're connected to the lobby. So you can see there's a bunch of games here. This one here doesn't have a lock next to it, which means I can technically log into that table if I wanted to. I'm sure I'll get booted, but if you're joining a game, generally they're password protected. It's a good idea to have that. The game master can also set this to be private so that it doesn't show up on the cloud. So if you look down here where it says public and all, the public servers are the ones that are displayed, and then the other ones are obviously not displayed. They're private. So once you connect to a session, so I'm going to go ahead and click this. Let's just say I'm in Alex's game here, which I'm really not. If you don't know the session, you don't have to ask him, but they'll either give you the DM name or the session name. It's in alphabetical order, so when you're connecting to this, it's alphabetic. When you are connected through the lobby, the only thing that is actually happening is the handshaking process of actually connecting to the other table. It doesn't really host anything other than your IP address, your passwords, and your protocols. Other than that, there isn't any game hosted on the server. It's only doing the handshaking process. The actual game is hosted on the host's computer. And with that in mind, there are some things that happen quite often with people that are using Fantasy Grounds, especially when they're new to it. One, they're either using an old computer, maybe something their wife used for school from 2018, or they have like an 18-inch or a 15-inch monitor, or what. I mean, there's all kinds of weird stuff that goes on. I've even had an individual who tried to connect to my table using his wife's laptop with a tethered phone connection. It doesn't work. You have to have the bandwidth as the host in order to have a pretty decent session. So even if you have a fast computer and your upload and download speed's pretty decent, it still comes down to physical bandwidth. So you might have really good internet, but everyone in your house is using it. So I mean, it's gonna cause issues, especially if you're using wireless. I don't recommend wireless as an end user. Fantasy Grounds is not going to, or Smiteworks is not going to tell you to go out and get a new computer or don't use wireless, because you can do whatever you want. But as a user, personally, I would not recommend a laptop, and I would not recommend trying to use a wireless connection. Those tend to create more points of failure. I realize that most people have computers, but not everyone has that option. So, you do what you got to do, but those tend to be an issue. When you connect to a table for the first time, if you got one player that just cannot connect, first thing you want to try to do is have that person check to make sure that they have the correct password. You'd be amazed at how many people said, well, I put in the right password, and they didn't. They'll either type an extra character, or they'll copy and paste it, and they'll actually be pasting in an extra space or an odd character that's not visible to them. The other thing is, when people connect to the table, if you have a firewall blocking Fantasy Grounds, either the incoming or outgoing, that will cause problems. And sometimes your antivirus will block some of the data. So those are the first things to check generally. You have the person actually close Fantasy Grounds, restart it, try to join again. If they're still getting that same problem, more than likely it's one or the other issue, where they have an antivirus issue or they have a firewall issue. Or it could be they're on a public server. I've had a guy that was trying to play in a hotel room in a public internet. They had decent internet at the hotel. It's just that the hotel has certain protocols and security in place, so you can't connect to a private network like that. So there's that too. So those are things to keep in mind when using Fantasy Grounds as your virtual tabletop. Now, that comes up so much, and it's like, oh, Fantasy Grounds sucks. Well, it probably does suck for that person because they don't know how to troubleshoot it. And that's generally how you start that process, is you want to troubleshoot starting from there. Is there any questions about that? All right. So once you have all that straightened out and you can connect, you'll join a game. Once you select the game, once you find it, if it's listed in the cloud, you will click the start button. You'll get attempting to resolve connection to server. It'll show like an IP address. If you have the password, it'll prompt you to say password, and you'll enter it. And then it will give you a note. It might pause for a few seconds and say that it's acquiring files. I don't have the password to this session, so I'm not going to log in, but that's what comes up. And then you would click retry. One thing is it'll say acquiring file list. Sometimes that'll take longer. Sometimes it'll stop because your computer or something's going on where the data is not being transmitted. So it'll freeze on you and you'll be stuck there for a while. So if that happens, just disconnect and reconnect and try again. It usually clears it. I don't know what causes it. It's all kinds of security reasons and that firewall and antivirus thing again. Also, once in a while, there's permission issues on your hard drive. So it's not allowing Fantasy Grounds to write to your hard drive. So that could be an administrative thing or something, so it just depends. But that's generally how you would connect to a session. There are cases where your game master might be using a direct connect. This is the older way to use Fantasy Grounds, and it's a LAN connection, and you have to use port 1802, and your game master has to do port forwarding. One thing about that way to connect, it is an older protocol. Most of the newer IP addresses are IP version 6. So if you have a newer internet address, it's not going to work with that particular setup. The IP4 address will work, but an IP6 will not. So quite often, users in Europe or in developing countries will have those newer connections, and they won't be able to connect without using a VPN or something like that. So this is a problem that was part of Fantasy Grounds Classic. And this is the reason why Smiteworks went to this cloud connection, because of that. That's one reason why. So that's generally the main stumbling points in Fantasy Grounds, other than having issues with too much content, or the GM has huge maps. Not a whole lot you can do about that, but if you run into that, likely it's that the person who's running the game is using a lot of content, or maybe extensions, or a combination of both. So that's something that a player can't control. But if you are in a session and you notice that, you may want to bring that up, that they might have to unload some of their content, or unshare some of the images that they have shared. So if you walk into a campaign halfway through and the GM has shared a bunch of maps and tokens and modules and such, it's going to be quite taxing on your machine. The idea of coming right into the middle of a campaign and then trying to play is kind of tough because of that reason. I would personally, if I was the game master, I'd have you connect before the session, and then it'll download all the files it needs, and then you claim your character and that thing before the next game, because that really bogs things down. It slows it down when you just do it live. So those are things to keep in mind. And if you're a game master, sharing way too much stuff is usually what causes that lag. And also you could be running out of bandwidth too. So those are things to consider. But players don't have a lot of control over that. You kind of have the mercy of the host. So if you're experiencing that, like you got way too much lag, or there's something going on like that, more than likely you're going to have to either disconnect and reconnect. Sometimes that'll clear it out. You can clear your cache folder, which is in the settings. There are a few things you can do as a player, but generally there's not much you can do about the DM. The DM has to kind of consider that not everyone has the same experience across the board when it comes to Fantasy Grounds, because everyone has different machines, they have different type of internet, they have different type of equipment. So that varies a little bit from table to table in regards to performance. There's been a lot of complaint about Fantasy Grounds performances, but 70% of the time is generally because the game masters have way too much crap loaded. And it's really what it boils down to most of the time. They'll either have a bunch of extensions that are kind of walking on top of each other and creating that problem, or they'll have these huge whopping maps with all these data points on there. All those things add up, and they cause Fantasy Grounds to lurch and to kind of lag on you. So that's something to keep in mind as a player and a GM, that you don't need every book open when you're playing Fantasy Grounds. The only time you need a lot of content is when you're building characters. Generally, when you're running a game, once all the characters are built, you really only need just the module, maybe the player's handbook, or whatever your core rule book is. You don't generally need all the other books. That's only for character creation. And once you've built your character, you don't generally need all that stuff. Occasionally, you might need a spell or something from another book, but generally, just the player's handbook's all you need as a player. So when the GM has 20 books loaded, and then he's got these huge maps that have a whole bunch of line of sight and effects on there, that's generally what causes that lag. Fantasy Grounds Smiteworks has tried to optimize the memory. What they have to do, though, is they kind of have to dumb it down to make it more accessible for people that have lower spec machines. And that's generally what we're feeling in some cases, is we'll have that problem where when people are trying to use it, they're like, this sucks. There's so much lag, and the performance sucks. But really, they have to kind of go with the lower common denominator for the programming and for setting that up. And a lot of people say, oh, that's not true, but it is true, because you have a lot of people don't have high spec computers, so they may have issues because of that. So you kind of have to have a happy medium between performance and features. So this is typically your tabletop that you'll come to when you first start Fantasy Grounds, if you've never run it before in a particular campaign. In the interim, when you actually start Fantasy Grounds, you'll get a setup window that'll pop up. That's generally the first thing that comes up when you start. You're going to want to take and hit the next button, and if you don't want this campaign setup to happen again, where it says show on load in the center here at the bottom, you can uncheck that, and that basically gets rid of that window the next time you come into Fantasy Grounds. But on the initial setup, you'll just go to the next button, because this is the connection to the wiki user guide, the forums, and that sort of thing. Once you hit next, you'll come to the modules area. This is where you'd actually activate your books if you're going to be running or playing games. Your game master will generally tell you which books to load. So if you come into modules, you click on that, it'll take you to the module section in the library, and it'll be a list of things here, and you'll see some content that might be available for you to load. If you click on the load filter over here, this shows all the content that's shared with the players from the game master, and any one of these that has a green check mark, you can load those. If you have content that's above and beyond what your game master has, you got to let them know. They can enable it on their end, which allows you to use your own content. No one else will be able to use it, though, just you. So if you have a book that your GM doesn't have, if he goes into his library and he enables that book, you can use it for your character. No one else can access it, not even the GM. So that is something you can do, if you're going to be creating a character and you have stuff your GM doesn't have, provided they allow it. but the host has the say on what content's allowed and what isn't. So that's kind of how that works. So any questions so far? So we're kind of getting into the setup part. So we talked about connecting to the table, and now we're kind of getting more into the setup of Fantasy Grounds. All right, great. So a lot of this content, I don't need this stuff. So as a game master, I would probably unload half of that crap. I don't need a bunch of stuff to run a game. Just a couple reference books, maybe the monster manual if you plan on adding your own. Generally, most of the campaigns already have monsters included, so you don't always have to have everything open. The monster manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide take quite a bit of memory data, but if you're going to be creating custom content or kind of running off the seat of your pants, you might have to have those loaded. But if you have a campaign that's already built and set up and everything, you don't usually need those. It maybe have a random encounter that might pull from there, but generally all that's built before you even need it. So that's the module activation, and once you go to the next button here on the campaign setup, this will bring you to the options. Not too many options you can play with as a player, but there is one I'll show you later where you can stop Fantasy Grounds from recentering the map. So if you have a map set up and you don't want it to move, you can actually turn that off. So in the options, it's kind of a feature that you may or may not like, but it's called Turn Auto Center Map. If you turn that off, that keeps Fantasy Grounds from moving, because what it's trying to do is move to the next player, especially if you're on a bigger map, it'll move. If you don't want that, you can turn it off on an individual basis. So each player and the GM can change that if they need to. But all the rest of the stuff is pretty much GM only, so it's not going to really matter. So once you're done setting up, you hit finish, and you're presented with the desktop. You might want to customize your desktop to your liking. So generally, when you first start, it's going to look like this. You might have the dice tower down here, depending if the GM has enabled it and shared that with you. But generally, after you get the character or the setup wizard done, now you're going to be faced with a pop-up for characters. So either you're going to be building characters, or your GM is already going to have some pre-gens made, or maybe you might import a character that you've exported from another session. Whatever that may be, you're going to be doing that in the character selection area. Once you have picked a character or created one, you're going to take possession of it, and it's going to say owned by whoever for the game master. I'll be able to tell who owns what. The only caveat with that is if you are playing in a one-shot, and let's say you have 6 characters to pick from. If you're a player, you log into that session or that table, and you see all those characters, pick one at a time. When you're done looking at it, release it. Because if you choose all of them, and you're trying to look at them, like trying to read them and see what they have, it takes it away from the pool of the other choices for other players. Now, if you're the only one that's going to connect to the table, no big deal. But if it's kind of a free-for-all where you got 5 people coming in and they have a choice of characters to pick from, they won't see any of those options because you'll have claimed all of them. So all you have to do is right-click on your portrait when you're connected and release the character, and that puts it back into the inventory for others to look at. That's generally an issue with pre-generated characters, one-shots, that sort of thing. Campaigns, not so much, because you're building your own character, it's yours. So you can also pick more than one character. You can control 2 or 3 characters at a time if you want. I wouldn't recommend that for newer players unless they really know what they're doing. It's kind of confusing, and you have to learn to switch between them, and it can be a little bit cumbersome for a newer user, but it can be done. The main thing, though, is when you're selecting characters, release those back into the wild when you're done looking at them. Because I've seen someone pick like 3 different characters and they're just sitting on them, and other people come on the table and they're like, hey, there's only like 2 characters left. So generally I have to tell that player to right click and release the character, or I can do it from my character selection panel, but I prefer that they understand how it works and that they manage it. That will allow for other people to choose other things. It's one thing I don't care about for this platform is that you can't preview the characters without claiming them. That's the only thing I could say for this particular thing, unless the DM has printed off the PDFs or something like that, or did a screen capture. Really no way to know what you're getting until you claim the character. So there's kind of a catch-22 there. So that's something that comes up occasionally, especially in one-shots and that sort of thing. So once you have your character, I'm going to go ahead and say that I'll just pretend like one of these characters are mine. So Dorig here is a cleric. I'll go ahead and pick him. When I actually claim him as a player, I'm just going to kind of finagle this, but I can take ownership as a GM. So if your game master wants to preserve a player, they can take ownership of one. When everyone comes on the table, that one won't be available. And then when their buddy or their friend or someone that's paying wants to play that specific character, you can right click and release it if you want. But that's kind of a way to keep it out of the pool of selection there. If maybe you know someone that says, "Oh, I want to play that character," But once I have this character sheet, what it will look like when I first start here is it'll look something like this. Whenever you open up a new window for the first time in Fantasy Grounds, normally it will open right here in the center, and that's where a lot of people get confused. Because right smack dab in the middle is where you're going to be doing a lot of playing. So keep that in mind with Fantasy Grounds, that a new window generally is going to show up in the center of the screen. Once it does that and you move it, if you leave the character sheet or whatever window it is where you want it to show up, it will stay there. You just have to leave it there. So if this was my character and I first come on the table and I'm going to claim it, first thing I will do is I'll move it into position wherever I want to put it. Normally, I recommend putting it kind of close to the combat tracker and the chat window so that it's kind of all conveniently in one spot. However, there's people that are left-handed that want it over on here or whatever, but just kind of keep it in one place. And when you join other games and other tables, or even as a game master you're setting up, this will help so that when you're playing, you have some sort of a what would you call you'd have some sort of semblance of consistency. Otherwise, when you play, you're just going to have a lot of issues. So are you saying, someone asked, are you rolling a 4K monitor? No, there's really no point in doing a 4K monitor. Generally, when you scale to that, it just doesn't look that great anyways. I think it'd be overkill. Doesn't mean you can't. I just have a regular monitor. Now, if it was a high-end, video game, yeah, sure. But for Fantasy Grounds, generally don't need it. Let's see. So once I have the character kind of situated where I want to put it, and I usually have it stretched out so I can see all the different things on the sheet. Because generally, when you first start, it's going to be like that. And when you go to your Actions tab, it's going to be kind of crowded, especially if you're a spellcaster. So generally, I'll have it stretched out so I can see everything. And this is usually where I'll park my character, is on this particular page is the Actions tab. That's where you're going to be playing the most. But we're going to go through more of this character sheet stuff as we go into this tutorial. We kind of give you the best practices and things to look for and that sort of thing. So I'm still kind of setting up the table. So the chat window is customizable. You can resize it. So if I right click on it and click on this little lock position, this padlock, I can actually unlock that and move it around. So if you go to unlock it, drag that bottom right corner, left click and drag, and you can pretty much set it to whatever you want. I usually have it the same width as the combat tracker. So I'll have it maybe like that. And then I'll open the combat tracker, which is up here on the top right, these two swords. It might be a different icon if you're using a different rule set or a different theme. So once the combat tracker comes up, then I'll generally place that here. And you can see I kind of overlay it over the top of the chat window, which is okay because I only need probably a couple inches down here on the bottom to read. Then I'm going to right click and clear the chat here. And this is the area that I'll leave free for my chat area. And the rest of the space I'm going to use for when they add NPCs and monsters and stuff. Because what will happen is if you have an encounter that's really big, and I don't recommend this, but it does happen where you have like 20,000 different NPCs and monsters on here, that really lags Fantasy Grounds down. But when you do that, you also have to scroll up and down. It's annoying. So like if you're like this, you have to keep using the slider on the right hand side to go up and down the combat tracker. So if you're a game master, I would try to break up your encounters a little bit so you're not overloading the combat tracker. It can get rather busy really fast. And if you have more than a dozen different things on there, it really starts lagging big time. So that's another performance thing, a tip. As a player, you don't have a whole lot of control over that. So once you have this combat tracker in place, then you kind of just set everything else up around it. And that's kind of what I've done here, is I have the combat tracker overlaid on top of this chat window. And the reason I'm doing this is so I don't have to keep moving these windows around. That's where a lot of people get frustrated and they just get pissed off because they're like, oh, I got to move this and then this is in the way. They don't realize that when you first open a window, it's always going to go in the center. But once you actually move it and put it in place, it will go back where you left it, even if you close it. So if this combat tracker, I can't make it any more narrow than it is. So if you got a 15-inch monitor, it's going to be tough because you can't really make this any smaller because it has to display all of these different details up here, which is your targeting, your combat, your reach, your effects, those sort of things. It cannot hide those because those are needed for gameplay. So that's the minimum it will go is there. So I usually size everything up around the combat tracker because that's the skinniest I can go on that. The dice tower is optional, but if it's active, you can right-click on it and unlock it and move it. So I usually take and put it next to the dice. That way I'm not looking for it. It's in a place where I can find it, and it's convenient. So it's close. And then once I have the chat window, the dice tower, my character sheet, I'll go ahead and lock these. You can lock the dice tower and the chat window. You can move the modifier box, and if you're connected to a table, the GM can actually move and unlock this area up here. But most of the time, you're just going to be locking and unlocking these two windows here. Kind of depends on how you want to set up your table, but this is a kind of a tried and true method of leaving yourself a little space for maps and such, but also having access to your character sheet, the chat window, and the combat tracker. So this alone will help you a lot. If you keep a consistent way of tracking this stuff and doing this every time, it really speeds things up, and it really makes a better experience for you. Because when you're not doing that, you're kind of dinking around, and you'll find that it's not worth the time. You'll just get really frustrated, and you get pissed off, and you just don't want to play anymore. You just get sick of it. So this is why we're doing this, is kind of to help you get a little bit more efficient and fluid with the interface, and give you an idea of how Fantasy Grounds can make life hard on you, or you can make things easier on yourself. So it just really depends on your play style and the table and such. But hopefully some of these tips will sink in and help you guys out. So any questions so far? So we're talking about the setup here of the windows and where everything pops up.
I've got one.
Sure.
And I'm somebody who's never played Fantasy Grounds before.
Okay.
Typically, my online role play for D&D has been D&D Beyond Roll20.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I found that makes better use, I'm pretty fortunate, I've got like a big monitor and a couple of small monitors on my computer.
Mm-hmm.
So I throw my character sheet with D&D Beyond on one screen, I throw the Roll20, so I've got all the big maps on the big screen.
Yep.
And then I've got a third window for just doing like quick reference stuff if I need to. Is it possible to span this Fantasy Grounds interface across more than one monitor?
I don't think so. I know you can do two, but you have to minimize it and stretch it. And I don't think it works well if you have mismatching screens.
Right. Yeah. Like in my case, it's one big one, and then I've got two
Yeah,
stacked on the left, so that
no,
really
it
wouldn't
doesn't
work for that.
No. Usually
Okay.
it works well if you have two of the exact same monitor. If you have it different monitors, it doesn't size correct. It just looks like crap. It doesn't work the way you'd hope.
Is it possible to have more than one of the Fantasy Ground windows open? Then maybe you could have.
Yeah, you can do a player.
Yeah,
you can do a player session. Like you can connect to yourself and use one as kind of like a dummy account, so you can kind of see what's going on from the player's perspective. But other than that, it's not really doable.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Yep. So back to the setup here. Another thing you want to keep in mind is what generally happens is, let's say you close your character sheet. You might lose that when you first start Fantasy Grounds. You're not sure what's going on. So if you lose your character, you can actually come to the combat tracker if it's up. Come all the way to the right where this little round pin circle is. Double click. That brings up your character sheet. Now, if you move your character sheet and close it, guess where it's going to pop up? Where you left it. So leave your windows either where they're at, or if you're going to move them, make sure they're in a spot that's not going to cover something else up. And that's generally where people have problems with Fantasy Grounds window management, because they'll move something and they'll leave it there and they'll close it, and then they go, oh, I want that back, and they'll come back to it. Oh, crap, it's sitting over on top of my map now. So the idea is to get all these windows in place as you build your table, and then eventually you'll have like a feng shui there, and you don't have to move as many windows around. That's what you want. Same thing with this combat tracker. If for some reason I need this space over here in this left corner, and I close it, if I go to open it again, it's going to go where I left it. You want to keep it where you want it to show up. And you really won't know that until you play a couple times. But once you get an idea of where you want things, leave them there. Now, if I want that space back here behind this combat tracker, I'm going to close the combat tracker, not move it. And then I'll reopen it. Some cases you do have to move it over. But if that's the case, remember to move it back. It's that simple. I don't know. I've seen a lot of people fight it, and they're just like, oh, it's over here. Now it's over here. I got to move this. I'm going to move that. This is where things get slowed down. This is where frustration starts setting in. And if you have a small monitor, you really have to fight that a lot. So that's just not much you can do about that. If you have a 15-inch monitor, I'm sorry. It's not going to be fun. So that is basically the main takeaway here in regards to managing the windows, is just remember, wherever you stick these things, that's where they're going to show up. And once you get that in your head, it's going to be a lot easier for you as a game master or a player. Or even if you're developing content, creating stuff, put things in a certain place. You'll always know where they're going to pop up, or usually, and you're not going to have as many issues. Simple as that. Is there any questions on that? Now, you don't have to do it exactly the way I'm showing you, but if you do it consistently, you're going to know where stuff is. That's all there is to that. Now, this particular character is actually on a battle map. You don't have any choice of that as a player. However, if you know that you were on a map last session, or that GM says, hey, I put you on a map, and you accidentally close it, there's a couple ways you can bring the map back up. You can double-click on the right-hand side of your character sheet, which is your token. I'm not talking about the portrait on the left. I'm talking about the token on the right. So if you double-click that, it will bring up the last map that you were on. And if you look at this, I've actually got this frame of this map where I want it to go. When you first open this frame, it's going to be in the middle, and it's probably going to be like that, and it's not going to be very useful to you. So when a map is shared to you, it usually will start off like that. Once that happens, as a player, you can left-click the frame of this map, put it where you want it, stretch it, whatever you want to do with it, and make that its home. So when you close this map and you lose it, or you need to bring it back up, it's going to go back where you left it. That's generally where people have problems. Is they'll play around with that map and they'll move it, and then they're like, oh, it's covering my character sheet, or the character sheet's covering the map, or whatever that might be. That's generally where the frustration can start coming in. So once you have the map in its home, you can generally leave it there. You don't normally have to move it too much. You might have to move it within this frame, but you don't move the frame or the window that it's in. So if you want to zoom in on a map, you click on the map and you mouse wheel in and out if you have a center mouse wheel. If you have a Mac, it might be a little different. You also have this navigation button on the bottom right. You can use that, but it's kind of hard to control. It's left click and drag, and sometimes it just goes cattywampus on you. It's kind of hard to control that. So if that's the case and you're like way over here and you lose your image there and you're going, crap, I can't get back there. So there's a little step down tool here, the toggle toolbar. The zoom to fit will recenter the map. Or if you're, again, zoomed out somewhere, you can right click on the map, go to view, and then you can do zoom to fit, and that usually will bring it back up to center. The other way to move a map is to single left click anywhere on the map except for on a token. And you can actually click in the map here, and you hold down the middle mouse key, and it will allow you to move the map, provided you have your token selected. So now that I have my token selected and I'm actually on the map, I can use the middle mouse button, hold it down, and drag, and that'll allow me to move the map. That's a little bit more controlled than using this little compass below. But your character has to be claimed. And that's usually not a player issue, it's a GM issue, so in regards to moving the map like that. But as a player, that's how you manipulate the map. So the map is something that you'll have to get used to, but once you have the frame where you want it, leave it there. Just zoom in and out as needed. Drag it around inside of that frame. Don't move the frame. And then you can zoom out if you want. I usually recommend, depending on the situation, but if you have a map that's any bigger than this, it gets cumbersome. And this is what I was talking about for large maps. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Like if you're playing Dungeon of the Mad Mage, they got this huge map. It's ridiculous. That makes it harder for everyone because you might be in this little area right here, and you're playing in here in the dungeons and all the walls and all that stuff's here. And then when you have to move or come out of here, you got to zoom way out, and then you're moving this stuff in and out. It's annoying. So as a game master, if you can help it, try to use smaller situational maps. It makes it so much smoother, and you have less data points. So what I'm talking about is on the game master side, when you actually go to line of sight, you'll have a lot less of these points all over the map, and that helps with performance. So if you got like a huge map with tons of these little dots all over the place, that's generally what causes some of that lag. So you'll be careful with that. But as a player, you don't have much choice. You get what you get. So this is generally how I set up my table all the time. 90% of the time, this is what it would look like if I'm playing or even when I'm running a game. I got the combat tracker, chat window. I have this particular slot here for characters. And then I have my map. And then down here in this bottom blank area is where I put my story entries or anything related to running the game. That's generally how I run this table, just like that. Once you have your characters in place, let's say you're playing two characters. So I'm going to bring up Figgin. I'll just pretend I'm using him as well. Might as well just do the rest. So here's Zayla. See, that's the first time I popped her character sheet up. That's where it goes. That's what it looks like. So I'm going to move that and put it in place. And I'm doing that so I don't have to keep, moving it. You just do it once. Move it into its home, and then call it good. See, there again, it's in the center. But once you have that in place, it'll go where you left it. The beauty of doing this is that when I actually go to use the game, this helps game masters too. So if you're a character and you're running more than one character sheet, or you're a GM and you got like 20 NPCs, this is the way to do it. So you have like this deck of cards here. So on the combat tracker, when you go to this entry, this is Figano Fetch. He's the first one on the list here. If I click on the right-hand side, that brings up the sheet. When I go down to Leyren's turn, and I select his turn, if I click on the little shortcut on the right, it brings the sheet up. So there, see, that one wasn't centered. So I need to get that one centered. But once you do this the first time, you don't have to do it again. You leave those there. So now it goes to Shayra, now it's Dorig, now it's Zayla, and Gallimar. So these are ways to kind of make it more efficient for you and not cover your whole screen with a bunch of different stuff. So just by utilizing these little links on the far right, you can do quite a bit. So when you first come to Fantasy Grounds, let's say you've already tried a session, you already got everything laid out. When you first come onto the table, that's what you're going to see, basically. So you're going to go, crap, where's all my stuff? So if you click on the combat tracker, it'll go back where you put it. If you want to make a shortcut to that, you can make a note, or you can use the shortcuts on the bottom. So you can make a run list, or kind of like a shortcut list. So I'm just going to do something that says list. So the first thing I do when I come to the table is I will put the combat tracker over here. So now when I start the table up, I don't have to find it or come over here and grab it. I just go off this list. So that'd be the first thing I'd click on is the combat tracker. And now there's a map that was associated with these characters. So if I double click on the right-hand side, or excuse me, on the left side where their combat tracker entry is, where their token is, it's going to bring up the last map they were on. So what I want to do is shortcut that. See, I have to move this now because I didn't put this in a good spot. There. So now that I have the map, I'm going to drag that onto the list too. That's the last map we were on. And as the game master, I don't know if a player can do this, but as a game master, I can shortcut everything if I needed to. So what'll happen is you'll have like a run list. There is an extension that kind of does this. It's called Window Saver. Basically, it takes a snapshot of all the windows you had open when you leave the table. But if you close all these windows, it won't work. You have to leave these open when you exit the table. So I just use this run list. I think that Window Saver doesn't save you that much time. So I usually put this down in the hotkeys. And when I come back to the table the next time, or if we need to take a break and the table gets shut down or whatever, and we come back on, I can pop up my list and then just click on these links. That brings everything up where I left it. So you can do it like that, or you can use the hotkeys below. I like to reserve some of the hotkeys for my player shortcuts, so that's why I use the list. Because I just want one list of links. I don't want 50 links in the list below, or in the shortcuts. So the shortcuts are really handy. So is there any question about Windows management and kind of getting more efficient with moving them around and such? All right. So the next thing is we're going to talk a little bit about the character sheets. So I'm going to go to Figgin, He's the first one on this sheet. We haven't rolled initiative yet. So if the game master asks us to roll initiative, generally that's on the front of your character sheet. This is the DnD5e Ruleset, so all those things will vary a little bit. But in this case, it's in the very center in the middle, so I can double click, and it will actually keep track of the initiative. So this is for Lord Gallimar, actually. So if I bring up Figgins' sheet, I do the same thing, and it will automatically add the Dex modifier, and it will record it onto the combat tracker. Now, as the game master, I can go to the menu, rest. I can rest everyone, or I can go to the menu and do a mass initiative. I can roll for everybody. I can roll for NPCs, or I can roll for just the characters, or I can clear all the initiatives. So I cleared all the initiatives. The players can't do this, but so I'm just going to roll initiative for everyone just for the sake of it. And now that rolled pretty much everyone's initiative. And it looks like Lord Gallimar is first. And since I have him set up here and all ready to go, when I click on his link, it brings the character sheet up. It's that simple. Instead of having 5 of them across the screen and having to move the map all over the place, I just have a deck of cards here. When I need the card, I pull it up. It's basically what you're doing. And then if you accidentally close the map, you can double click on your token. So the token on your character sheet on the right, or on the left-hand side, your token is in the combat tracker. It does the same thing. The key is to have this in a good place, so it's not going to get covered, or so it's not going to cover other things like I did earlier. So now what we have here are all the characters are lined up here. It's his turn. I rolled initiative. It went to the chat area. Good. Now, to make things even quicker, if you want to, you don't have to, but this initiative roll is a roll. You can shortcut this into the hotkeys below. So if I single left click and hold down the mouse button, the left mouse button, and I drop the die down there, now I have an initiative roll shortcut. What's handy about that is I can just single click down below, it'll roll from there. And what's nice about that is since you're spending most of your time on the Actions tab, you don't have to go all the way back to that sheet just to roll your initiative. So it's nice to have that roll handy and in the shortcuts. The only caveat to that is it's a static number. It doesn't change. So if your character sheet changes and your initiative goes up because you got a bonus from a dex bonus, maybe you had a ability score increase, something like that, all you have to do is redrag it. So if your character sheet changes in regards to your dexterity in this case, or if you have a magic item that gives you like a permanent bonus here, you're going to have to redrag that initiative and just replace the old one. Just drag it over the top. That way it's accurate, because you might go into like level 10 and you're still using the initiative roll from when you were level 3. So you got to change those out once in a while in case things change. And we're going to go to the skills tab on the right-hand side. And these are all your skills. So what I recommend my players to do is to shortcut at least perception, because that's used quite a bit in most games. This is a rogue, so I'm going to go ahead and do Thieves Tools. And Stealth. So if I need to use those, and I'm back here on the Actions tab, I can just single click in the hotkeys and it'll roll. Or if the GM says, hey, let's roll it in a dice tower, I can just drag it from the hotkeys, drop it in the dice tower, and it will be a hidden roll. So you can drag and drop the rolls either from the hotkeys or from your character sheet. It's a lot easier when you have your top 3 or 4 skills here, and you don't have to keep going back and forth from the skill tab to your Actions tab. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make is, make a couple shortcuts a little easier on you so you're not having to jump around on your character sheet as much. And this is kind of a player tip here. So if you're a player, make a couple shortcuts for things that you use all the time. Just remember that dice rolls are not dynamic. They don't update with your character. They are static. Once you drag it, it stays that way. So in other words, my skills here, if I go up in levels and my proficiency bonus goes up, then that's going to change all these totals over here. So if that's the case, I'm going to have to redrag my stealth and my perception and my thieves tools again. But that doesn't happen that often, maybe every 3 or 4 levels. So it's just something to keep in mind with dice rolls. So if you put dice rolls down at the bottom for shortcuts, you have to remember to update them occasionally. So any questions so far? Is any of this helpful? I don't know, but I haven't heard much out of you guys, so.
I found it pretty helpful. With the shortcuts, I have 2 questions.
Sure.
One, do the modifiers affect the shortcut? And 2, are there plans for dynamic shortcuts?
I don't think so. And as far as to answer your second question, the other thing is, since those change quite often, I don't think they're going to do it. I don't think they've made that choice. You'd have to ask or request for that feature. I think it's kind of I don't think it's a necessity. I think it's just something that people would do to help, to make their game a little bit more interactive for them. The first question, I don't know. It depends on the rule set, but are you talking about the modifiers on the bottom left? Or are you talking about... Okay. So if I go to advantage and I roll stealth, let's see what it does. Yep. So that worked. So let's go with +2. And let's roll thieves tools. Oops. That's not actually a roll. I accidentally link the description and not the roll. Let's try it again. Yes, it added the +2 in. So that answers that question.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. So there was a time where people tried to shortcut their attack rolls. I think there's a problem with ammunition. Let me check. I don't know if they've changed that. But if I drag the attack roll for like my short bow, I don't recommend it, but if you thought it would be cool, let's see what happens. I want to see if it's going to deduct the ammo. No. So if you use a shortcut for ammo, it's not going to check them off. You have to do it from the sheet. Yeah, so it worked that time because I put it in the actual tracker or in the chat window. So if you try to roll from your shortcuts, it's not going to track the ammo. So that's something that you got to be aware of. So I wouldn't shortcut attack rolls or damage. So generally, that's what I would do: is have the character sheet take your initiative and take your top 2 or 3 skills, and then go to your actions tab and set this up to where that's where you're going to be at most of the time. So when I have the actions tab open at the very bottom left corner where it says mode, there's 3 different modes. The standard mode is generally the mode that you're in when building your character or leveling up. When you drag over new features or add new spells, it will default back to standard. If you want to prepare your actions or your spells or usages, you can change to mode to preparation. And this is where you set how many usages or how much it's going to replenish if it does. Like, for instance, if you have something you only can use once per day, you can set one daily. Or if it's something that's like on a rest, you can set it as one rest. And when you check it off, you rest, and then it will come back, depending on what it is. So for this instance, I have, at the end of the session, I can go in and update my inventory, or in the beginning of the next session. But this is just a way to keep track of things. You can also set up effects. So if you wanted to, you can tie in a lighting effect with the candle and apply that too. But those are just the little bit more intermediate to advanced things. But for the most part, you can use this actions tab to track charges or usages on your items, or maybe you have an ability that you can only use once or twice per day or something like that. So that's what this preparation mode is for. So like on my consumables, when I change this to the actions tab, or excuse me, when I go to mode, combat, and display as actions, there's where the little bubbles are. So if I use a candle, I go ahead and check it off, and it actually records that in the chat window. And then if the GM wanted to go back later and see what happened, you can scroll back, or you can go to, there's a log that's generated called HTML chat. It's an HTML chat log. It's chatlog.html. And it stays in your campaign, and it kind of runs, it appends itself as you play. You can go back and audit this chat area. You can see who used what and what the roles were, and you can see where you might have had problems or something wasn't calculating right, whatever. But the GM can go back and audit that HTML if they need to. But nonetheless, this is just a convenient way to track what I've used. So if I use a couple candles, I check them off. I also conveniently have a code here. This is not the right code for this. This is actually for a hooded lantern. So that would be these oil flasks. But if you're going to do that, you can click on these effects, and it would apply it to your player, which will allow you to have the lighting that's associated with the type of light. So like a healing potion, that's a one-time use. So in preparation mode, it's set at once, and it's quantity of 1. So what I would do in that case is, let's say Galamar's injured. He has 12 wounds. So if I'm close enough to him, I can move to his location, and then I can apply this potion healing effect. So if I drag this over to him, that will automatically add the healing. Or you can also drag it to the token on the map, either way. So it healed 7, so it got rid of some of his damage. And then I would simply click on that, and it disappears off the sheet because I've used it. Now, if you wanted to bring it back, you can always go to standard mode and uncheck it. So maybe you went and replaced it, or someone gave you one, or whatever. But that's a way you can manage your sheets, kind of keep track of some of your consumable items. This would be more for a long-term campaign. I don't know if you'd use this in a one-shot, but definitely kind of a cool way to keep track of stuff. Then you have your effects for your items. Like this one, actually, this crowbar would give you advantage on a strength check if you were going to, let's say, pry a chest open. So let's just say that Figgin here wanted to use this in gameplay. He's telling the game master that he has a crowbar and he'd like to use that instead of trying to pick the lock. Maybe he failed or something. So you could apply this check to either him or whoever's going to do the reefing on it. So I'll just say, we'll just say that he's going to do it. So I can drag this effect either to the combat tracker or to the token of whatever you want. And it applies the effect. And then when he goes to do a strength check, then it will apply that advantage. So if I'm going to go to, let's say here's my strength, or maybe I would use athletics instead. So I'll drag and drop this into the chat area. It rolls with advantage. 15, I think that worked. So he's able to pop the chest open. So that's just some, a little bit of finesse there on some of your characters and your actions that you can do to kind of make things simpler. Now, I'm not expecting you to remember all that and that you're going to be doing that right away, but eventually that's the level of play you can work up to as you get used to Fantasy Grounds and how it works. Some of this stuff is not standard. Like, you're not going to find all this on a standard character sheet. You might find half of this stuff, but a lot of this is customized, so that's why it may not look familiar. And if it is familiar, then you know what I'm saying as far as that goes. Like, it's some automation that is not necessary. It's just more convenient. So that's basically that part. Now, one other thing I want to cover with the characters is movement. So when you have the tokens locked, the GM has control over that. But when the tokens are locked, you'll generally get a trail of your movement. So once he's moved, as the game master, I can approve that. So that's something that can be done in gameplay to kind of micromanage like combat. Like when it's not really time to fight and there's really not anywhere secret or trap doors or anything, I'll unlock it for my players. Kind of let them roam around a little bit if they want. But once it comes to combat, I'll lock it down so they're not moving all over the place. And then the distance marker will kind of give you an idea of how far they've moved. The only problem is if you move halfway and then your GM approves that, and then you go, okay, and then you do attack or whatever. Now you want to move again. You have to keep track of how much you already moved. So if it's not one movement, it's going to reset the tracking of the movement. So if this isn't one fell swoop there, you're going to have to keep track of how far you moved initially. So that happens when you have a turn where you've moved 5 feet and you attack and then you move again, and your GM has approved the initial movement. That's usually where that happens. Not much you can do about that, but that does come up occasionally. Another thing is, let's say you're going to move through these coils of rope. Okay, so I'm going to move my character. I'm playing a dwarf. Normally they can move 25 feet. Anybody see a problem with that? So the dwarf...
Step in the way.
That's right. So when you're a player, you want to keep that in mind of the obstacles. You might want to ask, like, can I move there? And if the GM looks at the map and says, oh, well, yeah, but you're going to lose some movement. Well, he's kind of lost 5 feet anyways, because he could technically go another 5 feet. The problem is, though, that you had this barrel. Normally, you can't move into a spot that's occupied. So even with that, if he said, I'm going to hop up on the barrel, then I would go ahead and approve that. But he only lost 5 feet, and that means he's kind of like dancing through these, and he ended up here. He's climbed up on that barrel. So 20 feet of movement, I'll buy that. It's not bad. I'll take it. But if it was something like this is kind of a rules interpretation. This isn't a hard rule. This is kind of up to you and your game master. But like something like this, let's say he wanted to move across straight line. Let's say you wanted to dash to the other side. So he said, I'm going to dash through there. So I don't know if you would allow that or not as a game master. I wouldn't. Not distance-wise.
Acrobatics challenge.
Yeah, I would have a couple of those for sure. Yeah, to be honest, if he rolled high enough, I would allow it. But you're still not going to get 50 feet out of it. Sorry. Probably like 40 or maybe, 35 or something. But nonetheless, these are things that you need to think about when you're a player, when you're moving, is you're going to lose a little space if your GM plays that way. They may not care. It might just let you do it. Maybe they don't want to slow the game down or whatever. Maybe they're being beneficial or nice to you. Who knows? But also, when you're moving on a map and you drag your token, you can stop there. You don't have to keep doing anything else. And then you can move again. And this waypoint can actually be moved. So if for some reason an obstacle got in your way before you got to that point, you can move this as long as your overall movement hasn't changed. So your path might change, but the distance may not. So you can use that waypoint to kind of decide that. So if you don't do a straight line, you definitely can change the direction you're going to move, as long as it doesn't exceed your total movement. So that's one thing. When you're moving past your players, you're going to lose 10 feet, at least. So if you want to go through your allies, the rules as written is it's going to be rough terrain, so it's going to be at least 10 feet. I kind of depends on the situation. Sometimes I'll just say you lose 5 feet, or you lose 10 feet, or maybe even 15. Depend. Like if this character had to go through both of these two, I would say 15 feet. I mean, that's my personal opinion. I think that's fair. But if it was just one, then it might only be 5 or 10. Depends on what the situation is. Now, if it's an enemy, you cannot move through them unless you have some kind of special feature. I think gnomes or some, I don't remember who has it, but they can slide in between the legs of a larger creature. I think halflings might have it too, but it just depends on the race and the situations. But in most cases, you cannot go through an enemy's token. You have to go around, or you have to hit them, knock them down, then go through them. But that's just a rules of written D&D thing. Other rule sets or rule systems might be different, but basically that's kind of your etiquette there for as a player for moving is take a look at the terrain, ask before you move, so that we're not having to keep canceling the movement. So that can get frustrating. I had a player that kept drawing through stuff, and I'm like, are you not seeing the map? I mean, what's going on? And apparently he had it zoomed way out, so he couldn't really tell what he was going through. So I said, why don't you zoom in a little bit and tell me what you see? And he's like, oh, crap, yeah. So, he stopped being mad at me because I kept canceling his movement. He's like, why aren't you letting me move there? And I'm like, because you're moving through like 50 things. And he's like, what are you talking about? And then he zoomed in, and I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. So anyways, these are things that you might come across as a player. You'll have problems like that. And the other thing is, if you land on top of another token, it's hard to resolve the token stack. So this player won't be able to engage with their token. So don't land on another token. It's not good. You're not supposed to end your turn anyways. And if you happen to leave your token there, the other player cannot access their token. And that's annoying because I have to manually go over there and change that. Targeting. So this is another thing that individuals kind of get lost on. So I'm going to go back up to Figgin. I'm going to use him as an example. Let's say he's going to set up a sneak attack. So I'm just going to pretend that he's back over here. He hasn't been noticed. Say he's going to attack Laren here. So right now, it looks like Laren has him targeted. So let me... Okay, so what happens is when you claim or have possession of your token here, if you hold down the right control key and you click on your target, it will show up here in the combat tracker that you have that particular character targeted. So that is something that players need to know. So once he's targeted, all I have to do is double click on the attack roll. And let's say he was hidden and he wasn't noticed. This is his first attack. So I'm going to give him an advantage. So I'm going to have the player click ADV for advantage. And then I'm going to have him double click on his attack roll. And he missed actually, but if he had made it, then I could say, okay, you can apply your sneak attack damage. So you can apply this and then he can roll the damage with the sneak attack bonus added in. So that would be one way to target. You can also target from the combat tracker. So if you're having a hard time doing it on the map, you can go to the combat tracker, and on this list here of actions on this line here, you go to the targets area, and you can use this to clear your targets, and you can drag this little icon or token onto any of your targets in the combat tracker that are visible. So you can drag this and it will show you who's targeted. So there's two ways you can do it. You can do it on the map, or you can do it in the combat tracker itself. The thing that people forget is to clear it. So when you've made your attack, if you don't plan on attacking or targeting that individual, especially if it's an ally, you want to clear your targets. So you can either clear it from the combat tracker, or you just come back to the individual that you targeted, and you just repeat the process and it gets rid of it. So that's generally where people have problems, is they'll target this guy, and then later on they'll forget and they're attacking another guy, and the damage ends up in the attack roll goes on the wrong person. So that's very common. So let's say that this Figgin, he accidentally attacked Laren. He didn't mean to do that. And let's say he applied some damage accidentally. So I'm going to drag. Okay, so he took quite a bit of damage. He took 12 points of damage. That's pretty devastating. Oops. So now anybody know what you do in that case? Besides tell the player to be careful. Okay, you can reverse that as a player or a GM. What you do is you right-click inside of the chat area, and you'll see this radial menu, and there's a plus or minus. That's positive or negative. So I'm going to click that button, and it turns this to a negative 12 instead of positive 12. Now, if I drag that value back to that user, it should subtract the damage that was done. It did. So it actually heals in that case. So if you accidentally drop the damage in the wrong place, right-click on the chat window, click this plus or minus for the negative value, and it will reverse what you did, and you just drag that negative number, the actual number, to whatever target was misclicked on. So that's a common thing too for players to come across. So once your players understand all these little nuances, it really speeds up gameplay, and it takes a lot of burden off the DM, and it just makes things funner. Like, you're spending less time dicking around with the interface and such, and spending more time on having fun and playing. So that's mostly what I have for you guys in regards to using your characters, using them effectively, that sort of thing. I'm going to show you one other thing with spell casting, and then we'll have some more questions. Okay, so I'm going to go jump down to Dorig. So when it's your turn, you have this next actor button, or in the case of a player, it'll say turn complete. You can actually shortcut that little arrow. So I can drag that to the hotkeys. So now when instead of reaching over here to hit the down arrow, I can just do it on my hotkeys. So now it's Dorig's turn. So I'm going to bring up his sheet. And he's already applied the bless effect on his allies. They all have a form of bless on them right now. If he takes damage for any reason, I'm just going to damage himself. He has a concentration effect that is part of the spell. So after you apply the spell, it puts a little tag that has like this letter C with colons, with parentheses around it. That tells Fantasy Grounds to check that if he takes damage. So what will happen is if he accidentally gets hit, or maybe an ally or enemy hits him, let's say he takes a little damage. Fantasy Grounds automatically checked for concentration, and it dropped the concentration because he failed the check. So all of these individuals that had the beneficial effect of that bless have now had that removed because he failed his check. So that's kind of a handy thing that Fantasy Grounds helps you do in game, is it helps you keep track of stuff like that. I'm pretty sure that gets forgotten quite a bit, even around a regular table. So that's kind of handy. The other thing is when you want to cast a spell, a lot of people ask me, is it easier just to, how do you draw a spell out? Well, you can use spell tokens, but since players do not have access to tokens, it's more of a burden for the GM because then they have to move it for them. And unless you have extensions and extra modules and stuff, it's just really not worth the hassle. So if you're going to do a spell, let's say in the case of Doric, let's say he's going to cast Bless again. So there's the Bless spell. If you read it, it tells you there's 30-foot radius on it. So you were going to right-click on the map, click this pointer, and then you have different pointers. You have a line, an arrow, a square, and a cone. So I'm going to do the circle here because I think it's radius. And you single left-click, drag it out to where it comes out to 30. All right, just like that. And then in the center, now I move that to the center. So he should technically be able to get everyone that, as far as range goes. And then when he wants to apply the effect, he's going to target all the allies that he wants us to apply to. So I'm going to hold down the control key. I don't have anyone else targeted right now. So he's going to target himself. He's going to target Figgin. And he's going to target Zayla Truesong as a bard. So all the squishy people. And then once he's done targeting, we're going to apply the bless effect. And now all of them are blessed. So now what would be the next step? Now that everyone's blessed, I took my turn. Now what? If I was a player. Going to remove that targeting. So I can either do it by holding down the control key and clicking on the previous targets, or I can come to the combat tracker, go to targets, and I can actually clear them all at once. That clears it. So when I come up to my next turn, I won't target the wrong things. That's generally what people forget to do. So on a spell that has concentration or something that you have to apply an effect to, or even an attack roll, if you have someone targeted with a bow and you want to switch targets, just remember to remove your target. That's a player thing. Even GMs do it too. So I've done it 100 times. It's annoying. If you get caught up in the moment and you're not really paying attention, and then you go to use your character on the next turn and it's targeting the wrong people. All right, when you're done with this radius, you can right-click, go to pointers, and remove pointers. And that gets rid of that. I've had people want to use spell tokens, and it looks great, but when it comes down to managing it, when you have to move it, and you're the one, if you're the game master and you're having to do all that, that's a pain in the ass. There are some solutions out there to make that a little easier, but there again, you're managing extensions and everything else. So I just prefer to keep it simpler. So everyone has bless on them, or at least the 3 that he chose. When I'm done with that spell, I'm going to check off a spell slot. This is a manual process, unlike the bow and arrows and such, because Fantasy Grounds doesn't know what level you casted it at. So I cast it at level 1, I only had 3 targets. If I cast it at level 2, I could have selected another target. It's pretty much a manual process. There's no real way to automate that. Not without a bunch of extensions and stuff. So that's just something the players have to do when they use their spells. They have to check them off. And as they check them off, if you use all your slots, the spells will disappear off your sheet. So when you're in combat and actions, your first and level spells are gone because they're used up. All the slots are gone. So if the GM gives the party a rest, they'll come back. So if I go to rest and do a long rest, all the spells will come back. So there's some things that Fantasy Grounds does pretty well. There's some other things that it maybe could improve on, but it does, a majority of what you need. You still have to do some manual intervention. Just people get so wrapped up in automation that they want everything to be automatic. It's not really playing the game. It's kind of getting towards a video game. You want to use it like a tabletop. That automation is fun. It does speed things up, but you don't want Fantasy Grounds to run your game. You want to run your game. So if you're the game master or player, run your character, run your game. Don't let the game run you. That's what ends up happening when you start worrying too much about 50,000 little things. It becomes cumbersome and it's not fun. And you end up spending more time dicking around with extensions and trying to get them to work than actually playing. And that's just something I've learned over the years the hard way. I do have automation, but I'd use what I know works. And the only way you're going to know that is to play with it and find out what works for you and what doesn't. There's no way to tell someone, oh yeah, do this, this, and that. Because there's so many situational things. I've had people come in and ask me, well, what extensions should I use? My first question is, how much do you know about Fantasy Grounds? Do you know enough about it to recognize if there's a problem, or if it's not calculating right, or if there's something that's not jiving, or if there's script errors or whatever, So I don't recommend any extensions or anything unless you know what you're doing. Because you're not going to know until you play around with it. And just to have someone come in and say, which ones you recommend? I don't know. I mean, it depends on what you're playing. Depends on your table and how much bandwidth you have and all that stuff. So don't get too wrapped up in that minutia of getting things automated. That comes with time. You're not going to get all that in the first time. The other thing about Fantasy Grounds is that it is a virtual tabletop simulator. It's not a video game. So there's people that want animated spells and all that stuff. You start adding all that in, it breaks down the performance of the platform. The more of that you add, the more points of failure you have. And it just becomes a burden. So be careful what you wish for. Especially if you're the game master and you're trying to keep everything together and you got things breaking left and right. It's not fun. Any other questions or anything that we want to cover?
I have a question.
Sure.
So I hadn't thought of this before until you mentioned it a little while ago. You were talking about, so I do a homebrew campaign, and you were talking about the amount of stuff that you load up into the game becoming a problem. Yeah. So I know what you were saying about, down to the bare minimum of just this and this, but what if you're in a situation where you're drawing a little bit from this and you're drawing a little bit from that? And I do understand that obviously, some of these whole books could take up quite a bit of memory, but like, won't we be using the rules from the Dungeon Master's Guide within the gaming session and stuff like that?
Potentially. It really depends on how much you need it. Like if it comes down to preparation or not. Like if you run your campaign off the seat of your pants, you're going to need more stuff. That's all there is to it. There's no way around it. Generally, what I'll have is some tables, a store. If there's any rules that I'm clarified with, I'll make shortcuts for those, or I'll make my own notes.
Well, I have my physical hard copy of my books at my side, and so, I mean, I can always rely on those, but making within the program. So I think what I'm hearing now, especially in your last final comments here, is that, this is just a visual platform. We don't really need to have it automating all this stuff.
No, we don't.
Okay.
It is a choice that you have to make, like a balance. Like, how much automation is worth all that risk and problems, as opposed to just being able to run the game and not worry about all that stuff?
I'm basically, like, for myself, looking for something that can make combat easier. That's pretty much it.
And this does. This keeps track of your rounds. It keeps track of your hit points. It keeps track of whose turn it is. It keeps track of duration. It keeps track of concentration. It keeps track of death saves. I don't know what else you want it to do other than make you breakfast. You know,
I mean, that's really ultimately it.
Yeah. There's no other. I mean, it's nice to have some of that other stuff, but it's really not essential. It's kind of like a creature feature. You know, it looks good and it's fun and it's interesting, but it can be really cumbersome. And to add all that in with newer groups of people that don't understand how Fantasy Grounds works really, really makes it worse, to be honest. They have to kind of have an understanding of how it works to utilize that stuff to its full potential. And if something breaks, they're not going to know. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but it's just another thing, you know.
So essentially, we're doing theater of the mind for almost everything, but we can allow Fantasy Grounds to take off some of the burden for combat.
Correct.
Okay.
If you use Fantasy Grounds effectively, and it's something that works for you and your table, that's already a thumbs up there. I think, honestly, if you do it a certain way every time and you get used to that flow and that workflow and your players get used to it, it speeds things up, regardless of what you have set. And that way, every time you go through those turns and those rounds, you know what to expect, and you're not all over the place. And then you're also developing a kind of, you know, a methodology. And once that happens, you cut down your time probably by at least 25%. I mean, at the minimum.
And I'm thinking as someone who's new to Fantasy Grounds, I'm thinking and all my other players are going to be new to it too. We're all just starting this out, right? Is that the simplest is the most simple we can keep it coming in, and then as we learn it, we can slowly begin to find out what more we can add to it.
That's right. You introduce features as you need them. Maybe there's something that's annoying that you'd like to keep track of. Look into it. You know, if you don't need it, don't add it. That's kind of the way I look at it, because it's just adding more potential problems. Because the plugins, extensions, they do break occasionally. Even though it's easier now to keep track of the updates, because now if you subscribe to the Forge, you know, you're going to get all this stuff. But we're kind of getting in more into the DM side of things. But nonetheless, keep it simple.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yep. So this is more, you know, if players just kind of have an idea of where to look and have an idea of where their sheets, where things are on their sheets, it helps a lot. I don't know how many times I've come to, let's say it's Dorig's turn, and I'm like, hey, it's your turn. Oh, okay. And he goes, well, I think I'm going to cast Guidance. Oh, what does that do? I mean, where was he the 10 minutes he was waiting? Right? How come he doesn't know that already? I mean, I get it. Some people get distracted, but then I think, okay, is he on his phone or what's going on, you know? So if you're a player, please at least prepare for your next turn. I mean, that's more of an etiquette thing than it is a Fantasy Grounds thing. That's true of any game. So, but that's one of my pet peeves is I'll have a table of 5 people, and I always have 1 or 2 people that kind of space out. They just, I don't know, they check out, and then when it's their turn, we have to wait for them to look everything up. And it's like, why aren't you doing this while your turn is not happening? Oh, I was trying to pay attention to the gameplay. Oh, yeah, right. Right. I've heard it all. So anyways, that's just something to, you know, keep in mind as a player. Is, you know, look up if you don't know what Guidance does, look it up before your turn. You can click on the little link. It brings up the description. If it's a spell that you have trouble with all the time, drag it down to the hotkeys. You have all those slots down there. Use it. Then when it's your time to look it up, or maybe your turn's over and you want to read it again, you just click on the shortcut and bring it up. So having shortcuts to the initiative, a couple of your skills, and then understanding what these actions do on your sheet and how your spells work and all that is huge. That really speeds things up. So as a player, once you become more efficient, it really just, everything kind of just starts snapping. It's nice. Then your DM's on his heels because he has to make stuff up as you go. That's a good problem to have, at least for the players. So any other questions, comments, complaints? I don't mind if you hate me. I have an item I got in an AL model that modifies initiative, but the item doesn't import well in the Fantasy Grounds Unity. How would I adjust my initiative roll to make sure it's accurate? Okay, so this again is the automation stuff, but if you go to your main tab and you come up to your initiative, you'll see if what's being modified or not. You can either have it coded in as an action, depending on what it does, or you can add a modifier before you roll. So if it's a +1, you can always type in a 1 in the modifier box, and then do your initiative roll. So maybe it offers you a +1, so you put the +1 in the modifier box. You do the roll, it'll add that in. So you don't always have to have it coded. You can use the modifier box down here. So that's something we've done with the Bardic Inspiration, for instance. So really no way to automate that. However, if she decides to use Bardic Inspiration, we're going to check it off and make sure that, that we know she's used one of them for the day. There's a little note here. So it doesn't really do anything mechanically, but it is a note that I'm going to drag to one of my allies. So if she does Bardic Inspiration on Figgin here, she can drag that over, and that reminds Figgin that he has a D6 that he can use as long as this counter here, this countdown doesn't go away, because that's a timer basically. And if he uses his inspiration within that duration, what I have him do is just roll a regular D6 or whatever the die is. Okay, it's a 2. So what I have him do is either drag it to the modifier box if he's going to use it right away, or drag the 2 down to the hotkeys. When he wants to use the inspiration, you drag that 2 into the modifier box for his roll. That way you remember what the roll is. So that's about the only way you can really handle that without a bunch of fancy stuff. So there's little things you can do to, modify the game without having to do a bunch of extensions. Yeah, it depends on what it does. I don't know how it actually works, but that's something that you'll probably figure out a better way to do it by the time you start doing it. But that's one way to handle it. So that's when you start getting into, oh, how do I do this and how do I modify this? And that's when you start actually learning what Fantasy Grounds can do. The real trick is, how does Fantasy Grounds interface with the rule set? That's what takes time. You can't teach that. That comes with situational things. Comes with time. There's no way to teach all that. That's like too many variables there. So, I've had people come in and say, well, I got this rogue and he's hanging upside down and he has his bonus. And it's like, come on, man. That's like so niche and situational. It's kind of like, do you think my DM is a butthead because he didn't allow it? Or, it's like, it's not really a Fantasy Grounds thing so much, but it is things that come up like points of contention or, interpretation of rules and that sort of thing. All that comes with time and experience. So anything else that we didn't really go over for players? Do want to mention that you can export your characters with the GM's help. So if you want to export your character, just let them know. You can export the XML file, but it will not export the portrait. So if you have artwork that goes with it, you'll have to have that little thumbnail too. Yep. No problem, Trey. So this month we have our the end of our Paizo month, which is going to be just stuff that's related to Pathfinder and Starfinder. Next month we're doing our Founders Day weekend, which will be at the very end of July, the last weekend. In the interim, this weekend coming up is the PugCon. So if you want to play a little, check the announcements. Go through the steps. You got to register on their Warhorn. That's how they organize their campaigns. And then once you're registered, you have to sign up for their actual campaign. It's kind of like an ongoing campaign that they just keep adding games to. There's several games on there. A lot of them are AL. And one of the reasons I've done these classes the last couple days is to help people with that and anything else too, DMs, anything. But generally, I don't run this class very often. Is because it's kind of neat, or not niche, but it's situational. I don't know if it's useful because this is a whole bunch of talking. I don't know if you're gonna remember it, but we are recording it. So if there's something that we talked about that that you don't remember, or that you don't say, hey, you didn't cover that, you can go back and say, oh yeah, you did. So that'll be on YouTube. So if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, check it out, because I put a lot of this kind of stuff on there. I don't normally record classes because of all the questions and stuff, but I figured this is kind of one of those things where we don't do this enough, so that's why I'm recording these. So we all good? Everyone happy? I've been rambling for an hour and a half. All right. So hopefully that helps. I'm not expecting you to remember all that, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. And if you're running games, keep it simple, man. All right, I'm going to end it. Good night, everyone. Good luck. Have fun.